Okay, hi everybody. My name is Celine. I'm the founder of Flowly. I want to welcome everybody to the workshop today. Just wanted to give everybody a moment to get comfortable, get settled in. I know people are just filtering in now. What I will say is there's going to be a chat on the right-hand side if you're on your computer. And then if you are on your phone, go ahead and look down. There should be a chat icon. I want to call that out for you because Pierre and I will be handling and making sure to address Q&A at the end. So as you have questions throughout, please send it into the chat. And you don't need to wait for the Q&A because at the end, then we can kind of like work through the questions in a quicker way. So please go ahead and take a look at that chat there. And amazing, I see a lot of people have joined us. So I might kick us off now by starting introductions. And then what we'll do is this workshop is really going to be around a conversation. So it's a little bit more informal, but I think you're going to get a lot out of the wisdom that Pierre has here today. And for those that are just joining, again, this is a Flowly workshop called Growing Through Trauma, how we're going to use breathing, meditation for self-healing. But honestly, the conversation is going to be even larger than that. And what I want to say is I would love to hear where everybody is calling in from today. So go ahead into the chat. Let us know what state or country you're calling in from. I am calling in from Los Angeles. I believe Pierre is in Egypt, if I'm correct.
That's right. Calling in from Cairo.
So we have folks all over the world today. Cool. We have people from LA and San Diego. Awesome. Okay. So I wanted to really share with you people from Northern California. We have a big California contingent today. All right. I would love to introduce everybody to Pierre-Etienne Vanier. Am I pronouncing your last name right? Okay, perfect. Pierre is a father of two and a student of Sufi Islam, a lover of the Turkish flute. And he's also spent the past 15 years learning, practicing, and teaching traditional and modern body and mind methods of stress and trauma management with the purpose of healing and integrating our inner wounds. Now, I just want to insert a personal note that every time I've spoken to Pierre, he's been amazing in terms of the depth of wisdom and experience he has, especially around trauma healing and how do we really address it. So I'm really excited to talk with him today. And he's been collaborating with Huntington Health, Cedars-Sinai since 2014. He designs and facilitates mind-body group programs for cancer patients and cancer center staff, and is also a co-investigator in clinical research focusing on fostering post-traumatic growth, which we're going to talk about today, especially amongst cancer survivors. He has taught pain management using mind-body practices to nurses, facilitated group sessions for staff, at Huntington Hospital, Arcadia Methodist Hospital, UCLA Center for East-West Medicine, and much, much more. So I'm really excited. And one more thing I want to add to sort of his depth of experience is that Pierre really comes to us with the specialty in balancing the nervous system. And as a lot of our Flowly heroes know, this is really, really important to the work we do here at Flowly. So there's really no better person to kind of lead this conversation about growing through trauma here. So welcome, without further ado, Pierre, to our workshop.
Yay, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here. Always a pleasure. It's great to see how, I remember a conversation a few years ago, at the cafe and talking about like what could be done and seeing how Flowly right now is growing is just such an inspiration. Also very happy to see so many of my peeps from Cali's in the house. This is great. Lived in California for 8 years. Love it. It's good to be here.
Yeah, when I first
Excited
met
about our
Pierre,
conversation.
he was still in California, and then he moved to Egypt. So it's been a while. And for Peggy, who's asking, we will try to send out a recording of this workshop afterwards. So no need to focus on taking notes. I would love for you to be present with us here today, and just ask us questions, and then we'll send all those questions, the video out to you after. One more thing I will say is the chat is private, so you will be sent. It was sent in question to me and Pierre, but not everybody will see. So you can send us any questions you might have, and I'll only identify you by your first name. I want this to be a safe and comfortable space for people. And I see other people coming in from Texas. Amazing. All right. So today in this conversation, Pierre, we talked about this. I would love to start off the conversation with this question for you about, what is trauma? And this seems like a very basic question, but I actually think it might be a little bit more complex than we think, because we hear the word trauma, and for some of us that maybe have directly worked on addressing our trauma, but for some of us maybe not. Maybe it would be help to define it.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to understand what we're talking about first, because I think also it's a loaded term, and many people that I talk to, that you talk to, would often say, well, it hasn't been that tough. My life hasn't been that hard. I'm not traumatized, and yet I do want to acknowledge that it's 2023, and by now, most of us, have had a rough last couple of years, which came on the heel of everything that happened before, right? Nobody waited for 2020 and COVID to get stressed out. I think the conversation on trauma is important and relevant because not only there's a widespread epidemic of trauma in the US for sure, and in many other countries, it's important for us to understand that many people dealing with chronic issues, many people dealing with chronic pain and anxiety often have a history of trauma, whether it's childhood issues. Those of you who want to look a little bit deeper into that may look into the ACE study, adverse childhood experiences. And really, it's important for us to understand what are we talking about when we talk about trauma, because when we address it, we can improve the outcomes of our treatment or the work that we're doing on ourselves. And so here, when we speak of trauma, we need to understand that stress and trauma are on a continuum, right? There's no such thing as, often people might feel more comfortable acknowledging that they're stressed out, but might feel, there may be a stigma around trauma, might be perceived as a sign of, I don't know, weakness or something like that. And so when we speak of trauma here, let's understand that basically it's not so much the event, it's not so much something that will be traumatic to everybody, rather than my internal response to an event. Right? It's not the nature of the event, rather than my internal response to it. So that, am I making
Yeah, so
sense
are you
here? Right? So something,
trauma is sort of our internal response to an event that happens to us.
something becomes traumatic based on our
Mm,
internal
mm,
response to that event, right? If you knew my mother-in-law, you would know what I'm talking about. I'm joking here because I love her, and yet for people to understand that something that may be traumatic to me might not be traumatic to you, and vice versa. And so trauma can look very different. Most people think about shock trauma, something big that happened, and many people are like, well, I've never had that, and therefore I may not be traumatized. But we have cumulative trauma, we have historical trauma, we have intergenerational trauma, we have vicarious trauma as you see people suffering, and you have mass trauma, and so on and so forth. And so let's understand that we can rephrase. I think it can be helpful to rephrase and understand that when we speak of trauma, we're talking about our nervous system being overwhelmed. And I feel like that's a more compassionate way, and maybe an easier way to understand what we're talking about here. My nervous system got overwhelmed because, to mention some of my mentors from the Trauma Resource Institute, they would describe trauma as like too much too fast, or too little for too long, right? Too much too fast would be basically like car accident, something violent. Too little for too long might be abuse, might be neglect, might be things like that, or might be living in fear, for 2 or 3 years, for example, which in itself can be a pretty traumatic and overwhelming experience to our nervous system. So let's see it like this, right? I'm overwhelmed, and that sense of overwhelm is creating an imbalance in my nervous system. I'm designed to be in a state of homeostasis, and yet in that moment, because there's so much going on, well, my body is not in a state of
Mhm.
balance anymore.
Yeah. That that
Makes
makes a lot of
sense?
sense, and I think it's really important actually to double I wanna go back to the idea of imbalance in a moment, but I just wanna double down on that concept that I think and we've seen this more and more. Obviously, we like, with Flowly, we've done case studies and clinical trials where across the board, everybody basically we work with has trauma, but trauma lives on a spectrum just as with most things, right? And I think a lot of people
Hmm.
only identify with the word trauma when they think of these gigantic, explosive, adverse events. Whereas I think most of us, especially like you said, living through COVID, we have all not been, if not exposed to or adjacent to trauma through that experience. So I think it's really important to ground it, like what you were saying, um, that too little for too long or too fast, too quick, too much too quickly. I think that's a really good way to kind of conceptualize trauma.
Yeah, and that creates an imbalance, that create a
Mm.
dysregulation. Um, and the last thing I want to say about this is to understand that dysregulation may actually be the best response for me in that moment,
Yeah. Well,
right? And that's the
mhm,
next thought provoking, you know, idea, which is like, oh, actually, for me to get into that state of imbalance might be the best response for
mhm,
me. I'll give you an example. If I'm in an abusive relationship, and at some point I'm kind of shutting down, to protect myself, that shutting down is actually a protective defensive mechanism. This is the best response in that moment. I've worked with people dealing with abuse, and who oftentimes had shame and guilt. Like, a typical thought would be, how come I did not blah blah blah, fill the blank, speak up, leave, did this, did that. And to understand that in that moment, that was really the nervous system shutting down and saying, do not, let's not respond, let's not talk, let's not move, because that may actually make things
mhm,
worse in that
mhm,
moment,
mhm,
right? And later on, when the coast is clear, it's time, then that's when we can leave, that's when we can do something to restore safety. But in that particular moment here, that was the best response for me. That there's an elegant design of the nervous system. Our nervous system is an amazing machine. It's an amazing organism. And for us to just think, well, there's something wrong with me because I responded like this. Actually,
mhm,
no. That spike, in that spike of different, a cocktail of hormone that makes you, want to run away from or towards, or want to protect yourself. There's a reason
mhm.
for it. And I think it's important for us to understand, to better understand, our own response,
And it doesn't
so we can have more
oh,
compassion.
that's exactly what I was gonna say. I was gonna say it's that approach I think leads to more self-compassion because there's no judgment on your response to a situation or to an event. That's your body trying its hardest to help to protect you. It's a survival response, and so I think that's really amazing. And so you mentioned this word regulation earlier, dysregulation, and we were talking about balancing the nervous system. And I would love to ask you, because we talked about this before, that journey of self-awareness to self-regulation, what does that mean? And like,
Mhm.
what can that look like for people, especially as they're, coming to terms, or maybe they've already worked on becoming aware of their trauma?
Yeah, so you mentioned that journey of healing, which, in the words of one of my teachers, there's as many paths to healing as there are human beings. And so I think people need to be careful when they're looking for the way to heal. There's your path to healing is probably different from mine, and from everybody this uh watching us right now, watching this replay. There are two pillars here, and you've mentioned them, which is, there's many pillars, but two key pillars include self-awareness and self-regulation. It starts with that process of self-awareness, because when I get stressed out and overwhelmed, I will disconnect from myself. I mean, why would I be connected to myself if I'm in a constant state of pain? You know, like that doesn't make sense, right? So that disconnect, again, there's compassion in that automatic unconscious disconnect, right? That gives us space so that we can function, so we don't go crazy. Um, at the same time, the path to healing requires and asks of us to come back home, to reconnect to our
Mhm.
feelings, sensations, to our body, so I can come back home and find that sense of peace from within, which truly nobody really can provide this for me. And unless I find this sense of peace from within, I'm probably going to be struggling. So the goal here is first to reconnect and to acknowledge, okay, what does that feel for me to be stressed out? And equally important is, how does that feel for me to be
Mhm.
relaxed? And I've mentioned to you when we were preparing for that talk that many of the clients I work with have a very refined understanding of their stress response, uh, but they have a very little understanding of their relaxation response. For good reason, is because they haven't been there for a long
Mm.
time. It's because many of us have been stuck, right, in that state of stress. And let's face it, and let's be honest, it's not just an individual issue. We live in a society, the caffeinated society, that pushes us to achieve more and more and more. And so there's that too. There's a cultural issue here, that can be a conversation for another time. But let's understand here that it's also important for us to understand, what does that mean for me to be relaxed, or what are the cues when I start to relax even a little bit? Because if I'm able to identify these cues, then it means that I can maybe start to repeat and replicate, and once again pay attention. And what happens? Oh, if I'm noticing my breath is going a little deeper, getting a little deeper, if my shoulders are getting a little bit more relaxed, okay, then what's happening? And what's happening here is that I'm starting to understand these cycles. We're not trying we Trying to live stress free, I think, is naive and frankly dangerous, right? Because that's not what we're trying. What we're trying is to not get stuck in a state of
Mhm.
stress. These are two very different things. Let me repeat that briefly for people listening to us here. The goal is not to learn how to not get stressed out. The goal is to learn how to not get stuck in a state of
Yeah.
stress. And to name one of my mentors, Mrs. Kevin Duffel from Lumos Transforms, something that's very helpful is for us to be able to identify islands of safety in our
Mhm.
life, right? These moments, when I can actually bring my guard down and just feel into what I need to
Yeah.
feel. Is that making sense
I
here?
love the
Right?
concept or even the visualization of islands of safety, because I think that really colors like what that might look like for each person. And because we talked about this yesterday, how you were saying a lot of people tend to think that the journey to healing is just feeling calmer and calmer and calmer, but actually the journey to healing, in most cases, looks like increasing the bandwidth for resilience or bouncing back and recovery. And I think that is really important to really think about and to really meditate on, because for us, it is not about eliminating all stressors and triggers in the world, but rather knowing how to address them, knowing how to recover once we've hit that snag, and also decreasing the time it takes to recover. I think that bounce back period. So I think that that's really important to
Mhm.
emphasize.
Yeah, that concept of bandwidth is key because, like you said, I think too many people are searching for, that state of, I need to be calm, I need to feel good, I need to feel this and this and that, and that in itself puts so much pressure, on them to achieve, in that journey of healing. When truly the journey of healing, when we come home, and I can only speak, about myself and many of the clients I've worked with, which is oftentimes it can be messy because if I've ignored my body or disconnected from my body, consciously or unconsciously, whether I was forced to do so, or because maybe it's just the only way for me that I had the only tool I had to cope. Well, then when I started to come home and to come back to my body, there's gonna be some anger, there's going to be some sadness, there's going to be some grief, there's going to be all of these human emotions that are also important for us to
Mm-hmm.
feel. And so, if for me the only measure of success is calm, collected, and grounded, well, it's not fair, because before I get there, it's important for me to feel what I need to
Mm-hmm.
feel. And it's important for me to connect to the reality of that grief, of that sadness, of that anger, of that frustration, of that fear, that I may have experienced just for the past couple
Yeah.
of years. How many people, whether the users of Flowly and people around the world right now are noticing, yeah, I'm dealing with a lot of anxiety, and many people are dealing with also immune issues, because again the immune system is breaking down, because living in fear for several years in a row takes a
Yeah.
toll. And so it's important for us to come back to the body, and to come back to the body, that's why it's important for us to build that that capacity to self-regulate.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about that capacity to self-regulate, it doesn't mean, oh, bring myself back to a state of calm. It means having the capacity to connect to the body, and maybe to feel some of that fear, not all of it, but some of it, to connect to some of that sadness, not in a way that's overwhelming and that's going to shatter me into pieces, but in a way that's like, okay, I can feel it,
Mm-hmm.
I can feel it, I can cry, I can yell, I can process these emotions, hoping that you have a safe space to do so, because I believe it's much easier and healthier to do that within a supportive community. um,
Yeah.
and but that capacity to say, okay, I have tools, let me really, with these tools, connect to myself, process bits and pieces, and then slowly be able to start to see the light at the end of the tunnel. But it's not healing is not a linear
Yeah.
process. It's cyclical. We go back, we go down in 2 steps forward, one step backward. It's a
Yeah.
dance. And so if we could give ourselves permission to be more patient, more gentle, more understand that maybe when I start to get angry, and again, I'm talking about my personal experience as somebody who pretended for many years that I didn't get angry. BS. I would get angry like everybody else. The only difference is that I wouldn't let it
Mm-hmm.
out. And so guess what? I had back issues and I had chronic pain issues because of course my body was like, okay, we're not releasing it, we're not processing it. I'm gonna push it deep into your
Mm.
tissues, right? And so for us to be able to express that, to process, is really the ability. That's the self-regulating
Yeah.
piece that we're
That
talking about.
that example you gave of your personal experience with the anger causing that chronic pain, I just want to call out for folks, which I think a lot of people have heard me say, is that there's a real physiological impact on your body when you live in that sustained repression or stress state, and your body's actually deploying pro-inflammatory proteins called cytokines that are creating inflammation in your body, breaking down muscle and tissue, creating pain. And so all that we're talking about, I always like to emphasize, there's the physiological, there's a psychological, and there's a social impact on your body. And it's really important to examine all three. And one thing I also want to double click on is, you're saying, the process of connecting back to your body, it can really, it's not a linear journey of, oh, feeling better and better. There's a lot of anger or fear or sadness or maybe even joy in that process that we have to acknowledge. And it reminds me of a lot of the patients we've worked with at Flowly, especially when they've come from a history of anger or trauma and just a lot of complicated health history. What the first time they do Flowly, and the first time we see their physiological indexes start to go down, they tell us that they feel very uncomfortable. It's a very uncomfortable feeling. It's almost like striking
Mhm.
paralyzing fear in them that their body is relaxing. And I know you have a lot of experience with this, so I wanted to know what your thoughts were on that.
It's just unfamiliar. When you've been running on overdrive for years or decades, of course it's going to be unsettling. And I think that's why it's so important to the fastest way to heal is
Mm,
slowly. Um, and we could actually say even slowly, that could be, but the idea to say to reconnect to this emotion little by little, to go slow into that process of reconnection is important. Because of course it's going to be scary. Intellectually you understand that, how come, I should feel better and better, and yet yeah, it can be unsettling because it isn't familiar. Whatever is unfamiliar is scary, right? And so that's why you need to, I don't believe, the longer your practice session, the better. I think sometimes many, this tendency people have taken on meditation and feel like they have to sit for an hour, or they have to sit for
mhm,
30 minutes or even 20 minutes. And I'm like, yeah, but actually, you know what? Maybe 2 to 3 minutes or 5 minutes is exactly what you need right now, because it's going to reconnect you to your body. You're going to be able to feel into your feelings without opening Pandora's gate, without feeling too much of it, because then it becomes overwhelming. And just to piggyback on what you were saying about, okay, that the joy, um, there's no joy if there's no
mm,
sadness, right? Like being, and I hate to sound cliche here, but I see so many clients, because of feeling so overwhelmed and stressed out, aka, and traumatized, who are kind of, who have emotionally flat lines, you know um, and so that they don't feel too much of the fear. The problem with that is that then they don't feel anything else much, right? It means that the joy is less, the gratitude is less, everything is less, the intensity of the emotions become, everything becomes dull. So yes, it's a way to protect from the pain and the anger, but it's also unfortunately getting in the way of us feeling gratitude, joy, happiness, and love, and so on and so forth. I've had people coming to me and saying, help me feel again, because I feel so
mm,
numb. And so here again, the remedy to the numbness is to feel. um, and so by giving yourself permission to reconnect to some of what has been labeled as negative emotions, which I feel like is very counterproductive and unhelpful. These are not negative emotions. Sadness and grief and pain and so on and so forth, these are all emotions that will give us perspective. Um, and from that place, this is when, I just hung up with a client who, from that place of pain and anger, was in tears because of the
mm.
gratitude, that she had for what she was able to witness. um, and that may be the segue, into the
Yeah.
the
Yeah, I
growth
wanted
that comes
to, yeah,
from that comes from
definitely wanted
that.
to, because I think a question that is coming to my mind, and I'm sure a lot of people's, is, okay, so where does the growth come in all?
I don't know if it's my connection or Celine's connection. No sound. Okay. Mary, can you guys still hear me? Okay. Celine, we lost you. Okay, everybody's still here. Okay, so we'll take a second here while Celine is reconnecting, to pause, to take a breath. If you have any questions here, now is a good time, as we're about to embark really on the flip side of that. Excellence. So whenever Celine is back, let's start to embark on that conversation around post-traumatic growth, which is really an important one. And again, if there are any questions here, or reflections or comments, anything that resonates with you, anything that challenges you, now is a good time. Feel free to drop it in the chat. Celine, welcome back.
Thank you. Well, I would love to, and if I pop in and out, I think it must be my Wi-Fi. Um, it it's so shaken by our conversation. It's,
No.
but I would love to, yeah, hear what your or even just to introduce people to the concept of post-traumatic growth, because I know that that is not something I've commonly heard of in the
Mhm.
past.
Yeah, and I think it says a lot about how we approach healing. Uh, and this is not a conversation about healthcare, about the healthcare system in the US, which in itself could be a whole conversation. Uh, but what I want to address is the fact that, everybody knows about post-traumatic stress. Everybody knows about post-traumatic stress disorder. We've become experts at our issues and ailments and labels. And I'm saying that very respectfully. Um, and unfortunately we've forgotten that um, these challenges can be springboard for an amazing growth, right? I mean, nobody I know who's in a great place is going to challenge himself or herself or themselves, and try to feel things and learn new things. If you're in a good place, typically that's it, you're going to cruise. um, and here understand that concept of post-traumatic growth is the idea that it's the idea of that it's not just that silver lining, uh, but once again it's not to bounce back, to use that expression that you used earlier, rather than bouncing forward. Is
Mm,
saying that old me is gone. I mean, you've mentioned earlier, a lot of my work is with cancer patients. um, and some people try to go back to their old self. The old self is gone. Why? Because they've learned too much, they felt too much, right? And not too much, but what they've experienced changed them forever. Somebody who's lived with chronic pain for years and years and years, has experienced so much that there's some deep learning into this experience, which can be, the learning in itself can be painful. But that concept of post-traumatic growth here, which is both it's both something that's been studied academically fairly recently, right? In the 90s, the first papers starting to come out from the University of Charlotte, North Carolina. Dr. Tedeschi and Calhoun started to study and coined actually that term post-traumatic growth. But I mean, look at all major religions,
mm,
and all the holy books that are also
mhm,
mentioning the transformational power of suffering. And in that transformational power of suffering here, um, that's an opportunity for us to transform, for us to change, for us to bounce forward, for us to shed that old version of ourselves, and to become that new you. And to kind of stay with and to be a little bit more specific around that concept of post-traumatic growth. um, Dr. Tedeschi and Calhoun categorized several areas where typically you may notice some growth, you may notice some changes. Um, the first one is changes in your relationship towards yourself, how you see yourself, how you perceive yourself. Um, how many people said, I feel like I'm so much stronger than I thought I was, right?
hmm,
Because I'm here and I made it
mhm,
and I survived, and I overcame. Also, many people become so much more compassionate uh,
mhm,
for for others. And so the second area of changes is that relationship towards other people, um, which can be more compassion for people going through a similar ordeal, or which can also be more, hopefully, clearer boundaries. How many people have said, you know what, if my time is limited, I'm not going to lose my time with that person and that person, right? Because they're just not, they're just energy vampires. They're not contributing to my well-being, you know. And so I want to bring people and focus on people, who love me for who I am, and so on and so forth. So changing the relationship to self, changing the relationship with others, there tends to be a deeper gratitude for life. We spoke earlier of, you spoke of the joy. I want to bring the gratitude. Uh, that gratitude can be profound when we've faced, pain and death, and like, so, from close. Um, things take a little, just the most simple things take a different taste. Saint Francis of Assisi, when asked, if he had one more day to live, uh, said, I would continue to host my garden.
Mm,
because it was like these simple things for me are really truly what brings me joy. And that's what we see, that's people saying, I'm having so much gratitude for these little things in life, being able to, me and my back being healthier and stronger, being able to pick up my kids. It seems
mhm,
so simple, and yet it changed my life. um, New possibilities, right? People shifting careers, saying this is not what I wanted to do. I want to do something completely different, that fulfills my soul. And finally, there's also changes in spirituality, in how we feel
mm,
connected. And so all of that comes from the struggle with adversity. And it doesn't come as a package, unfortunately. I wish I could say everybody's going through a traumatic experience will experience that growth. It's not true. Um, but when there's an awareness, and I want to say willingness, uh, and most importantly, when you're being given some skills, a safe space, a supportive community, then you have an opportunity to come out on the other side. And that's where I've been doing this work. And almost 20 years ago, I encountered that concept because I was working with people living with HIV and AIDS. And one of the patients told me, she was like, you know what? HIV is the best thing that ever happened to me. And I was so confused because I did not understand that growth that she had experienced. Because right now she was so full of life. She was so appreciative for everything in ways that I wasn't, because I was
mm,
taking things for granted.
yeah.
I hadn't been through that dark night of the soul.
You touch on the concept of gratitude a couple times, and I'm really intrigued by that. But it also leads me to kind of my next question, because I want to make sure we have time to answer a couple questions. But what can someone who's listening here today, how can they kind of ground this idea of post-traumatic growth in their own lives? Is there something they can do like day to day, or a couple things or concepts or ideas they can really wrestle with and think about, to kind of bring this into their own lives?
Sitting with yourself is an important start. um, and and like we mentioned earlier, it's good. I have a beef with positive thinking, because I do feel like it's a very limited way to approach things. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't, cheer people up, and you shouldn't be supportive. Uh, but telling people, you're okay, you're fine, everything's going to go well, is not necessarily what people need to hear. Sometimes you just need to say, like, yeah, that sucks. It hurts, and I'm here with you, and I'm going to hold your hand. Instead of like, oh well, what you're feeling is just, don't worry about it, everything's going to be great. I think sometimes our own discomfort, we're projecting our own discomfort on people, which is, I think, is disrespectful. It's not, we
Mm,
don't mean it, but it's disrespectful. Anyway, to come back to your question, sitting with yourself and being able to acknowledge, and make space for the emotions and the sensations, the inner experiences, that are real. I'm going back here to what we mentioned earlier, to the anger, to the fear, um, and I'm seeing, Peggy's question, what to do when the fear feels too big. I'm going back to the comment from earlier, which is like, well, by learning how to self-regulate, you learn how to connect to some of that fear for just a few moments. Um, if you wish, it's the image of like, well, instead of throwing yourself, in raging waters, you just dip your toe, in that water, and then you come out. And then the next time it's just your feet, and then the next time you go up, to your knees, and so on and so forth, until eventually you feel more equipped and more able to deal with
mm,
that. So sitting with it is important, but sitting with it with what you mentioned at the beginning of this talk, which is compassion, which I
mhm,
think is underrated, um, because there's so much. pressure for people to feel better, to feel good, to be strong, to be resilient. Um, and we often forget to remind that people can also be patient, that your body needs time to heal.
Yep.
And you don't recover from whatever you're dealing with, in a week or two. Sometimes it's going to take a year or two. It's going to take a while. And so for you to be able to sit with yourself, connect to your body, which can be connect with an awareness of it, and maybe even connect physically. I often talk to my body, and I may place a hand on my heart, or I may just give myself a hug, um, and just let my body know, like, I'm like, "Yeah, I know you're scared. I feel it. I feel the tightness. I feel the tension. You know, uh, I know you're scared, and it's okay to be scared. And right now, I'm just going to sit with you, and I'm going to hold your hand like if I was holding my best friend's hand. Um,
Mm,
and I often have to remind myself this because, I trust I'm not the only one, but oftentimes I may talk to myself in ways that I would never talk to somebody else like that.
yep.
I can be really harsh towards myself because nobody's listening, but I would never say that to a friend of mine. And I would never say that, to somebody else. And so why do I do this to myself? And that judgment, that pressure, you know, um, creates a disconnect, creates a
Yeah.
resentment, tightness, tension, a further dysregulation of my body. So when I as much as I can, with patience, with compassion, with kindness, reconnecting to the body and saying, that's what you're feeling right now, that's what we're feeling right now, all right, let's just sit with it for a little bit. And how
Yeah.
many times it just amazes me all the time, because oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes, if we stay there for a little bit, it's going to be, oh, it's scary, or it's getting a little bigger. And then what? Oh, well, actually, it's starting to diffuse a little bit. Oh, it's moved. Oh, it's somewhere else, right? Oh, it's smaller. Oh, it's more manageable, right? In
Hmm.
other words, it's starting to move. We're getting unstuck. And
Hmm.
that's what we want. If the goal is, well, I want to feel good and I want to feel healed right here, right now, well, then no, then you're not being patient. You're putting too much pressure on yourself. But if I'm being gentle, and maybe my goal is to be able to redefine my experience of my pain or my anxiety, what it means in my body, then that can be a game changer,
Hmm.
because then it
Yeah.
creates space, right, for things to move.
Yeah.
Am I making sense here?
No, it makes total sense. And I just want to say that we have a couple of minutes left. So for folks, I know we touched on a couple questions people have, but if you have any questions, please send it into the chat now so we can address it. But I really like what you were saying too about um, holding your own hand or hugging yourself as if you're your best friend, because it reminds me of Alan Gordon, this pain specialist, who said, self compassion is so important. And one tip for self compassion is when you are feeling that self judgment and you're talking to yourself in that harsh way, to imagine yourself as the 8-year-old version of you. And how would you speak to an 8-year-old? And literally do it, like speak to yourself as an 8-year-old. And you might find that you're speaking in a completely different way, and that compassion just comes out. So there are these little tools and tips that you can utilize to be able to start that process safely and slowly.
I love this, and if I may briefly comment on that, when many oftentimes when we get overwhelmed, we find ourselves in what we call a freeze response. A, and the seats of that freeze response is the gut area, and it's also the seat of our inner child. And so it's absolutely fantastic, and thank you for the reminder that sometimes just holding, that inner child, not not give him or her or them a pep talk, but rather just saying, I see you, I love you, and I'm
Mhm.
holding your hand here for I'm going to hold you for as long as needed. And that's
Mhm.
just amazing how the body responds. I do this day in,
Mhm.
day out, with myself and with people. And it's just amazing to see how the body starts to, release, things start to unfold. Yeah.
Yeah. And that relates, I think, I see this comment from Elle who said, I love the
Mhm.
concept that healing is a dance up and down and sideways. Just take a little at a time. I've learned to love myself and others through forgiveness rather than judgment. Hmm.
Mhm. Yeah, there's no, I mean, it's a journey, right? It's a lifelong journey. So, there's no destination. I think it's a reminder to myself and to anybody who wants to hear it. It's, what are you rushing to, right? It is a journey, and every step of the way is just like, if you take your breathing, we had talked about, breathing eventually, and we decided finally to talk about more about post-traumatic growth. But paradoxically, I think the breath gives us an important lesson, which is like, if I breathe slower, I'm more able to absorb oxygen. And I think it's a beautiful image for our healing. If I heal slower, I'm more able to absorb the lessons. And that doesn't mean that I'm going to be in pain longer. It means that my healing here is more substantial, it's deeper,
Mm-hmm.
it's more
Yeah, I
comprehensive,
think
it's
that's
more
important.
holistic,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
That I think that's really important. And I see these two questions, actually, I think similar questions from Susanna and Sam. How can we support others or guide others to try this way of healing? How can I encourage a loved one to begin this? And I just want to add my vote to these questions, because I think some heroes know that I personally live with someone who has an addiction and who has what I consider invisible illness. It's always a question in the back of my mind, like, how do we help the people in our lives and the loved ones through a process like this?
The short answer is, regulate yourself first, because the
Mm,
most helpful and supportive things to them is a regulated you, right? You can't do the healing for them. um, and I speak from personal experience with a father dealing with many health issues, and I'm like, oh, but you can do this and you can do that and you can do this and you can do that. But I could provide options and solutions until I turn blue. They're not in a place to receive it. And so the best thing that you can do, yeah, is that gentle example, El.
mm,
Thank you for that. It's just for you to embody this, because if you embody it, if you're that anchor in the midst of their storm, then they have somebody, like, that can help them to co-regulate. And the goal
mhm,
is for them to self-regulate, but in the meantime, co-regulation helps, right? And to be careful not to make it, a codependent, and complicated relationship, but at least for them to be able to experience, that sense of co-regulation and calm, or groundiness for a few moments. I think is the best gift that you can give to somebody.
yeah. Christopher is asking, how do you bounce back from fear that's gone on your whole life?
Yeah, and that's the beginning of the conversation. Huh? It's just you start by redefining your relationship with that fear. You start by experiencing that fear, some of that fear, a small amount of that fear in your body. And before you do that, you learn some skills, you learn some tools.
Yeah.
I mean, slowly, and biofeedback and things like this. This is really about it. It's about, okay, how long can I stay with that before it becomes too much, right?
Mm-hmm.
And before I connect to that fear, how can I learn how to breathe and regulate my breath, right? And my heart
Mm-hmm.
rate, and so on and so forth. These are all such basic but such foundational skills that I feel like are, uh, they're life-saving. Once you learn how, how to breathe, how to regulate your nervous system, you know, there's nothing is impossible.
Yeah. And I just want to add on to that, because I think that's really important. Um, the breath work, you do at Flowly, and all the skills that you're learning, even through workshops like this. I think it's important to keep that in your toolbox as you, dip your toe into that water if you're like a little bit at a time, but also know that there are some days where you don't have to dip your toe in. There's some days where you feel ready, just to always acknowledge and be aware where your body's at, and then meet yourself where you're at that day. And again, approach it with self-compassion. I think that's really important.
And if I may just add one more thing, I want to stress one more time the importance of a supportive community,
Mm-hmm.
because sometimes these emotions are just too big to be
Yep.
processed alone. And I speak from personal experience. I just had so much anger, you know, like shoved into my body for so many years, which explains the chronic pain and so on and so forth. And I just didn't know how to connect to a little bit of it. And so I needed, I had to search for safe spaces for, I did some group work. I personally did some men's work where I needed that space where I had people who had walked that journey, they had walked that path,
Mm,
and they had been there, and they were like, it's okay. They kind of gave myself, they helped me give myself permission to feel what I needed to feel, and I didn't feel equipped to do that alone. And so that's maybe one more thing I want to say. Yes, it's important, get some tools for individual practice, and remember that you're not alone. I mean, just
yeah.
in Flowly has a whole community, a growing community of people. So to be able to reach out, to be able to be witnessed, right, in that,
Mm.
in both your struggle and your healing, I think in itself is powerful medicine.
Yeah, that social connection piece is I don't I think a lot of people disregard it because it doesn't feel scientific, or it doesn't, even though there are so many studies that show how important social connection is, if not the most important thing to our health in many cases. But so I do want to shout out for that idea. We do have the bubbles, so the small support group. It's a new feature, so not everybody's aware of it. Small groups that you can attend every day, drop in and out as you wish. But that can be one small place to start, and of course, you'll build out from there. Sheila's asking, is there a tool that might be better than others?
No, whatever works for you.
Yeah,
I mean, for some people it's biofeedback, for some people it's hypnotherapy, for some people it's movement, and it's dance, and it's this, it's meditation. There's the good news is there's a million tools. There's millions of tools out there,
yeah.
literally. And so explore what resonates with you. The tool that's better than others is the one that works for you.
100%. Um, I think that's a really good place to wrap up. I 100% agree. There's, like you were saying, Pierre, in the beginning, there's a million infinite ways to healing. So there's so many tools. And I think for most people, it's a combination of different tools and different ways of approaching themselves. So definitely that exploration is so important. I want to thank everybody for being here with us today, for being present, for being so engaging. I hope this was illuminating for you. I know it was for me, even though I talk to Pierre all the time, but it was really helpful. And if you have any comments, feedbacks, if you'd like to hear more of this, let us know. We will try to record this, make sure that is sent out as a video. But of course, anything else you might be looking for, we would love to be here and support you. Thank you so much, Pierre, again, for sharing your wisdom and experience. I'm sure you know this, but it's a good reminder that you touch a lot of people. And I want to share this comment by Elle. Thank you, who said, I'm in tears. This is all very moving and feels so truthful. I am on a beautiful spiritual journey with lung cancer. Love to all. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing, Elle. And I hope everybody has a beautiful, beautiful rest of your day. Thank you,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Be well. Bye bye.